promising I was one of Jeff's PhD students. I wasn't going to say anything, but I felt after the talk session I should just quickly say how me and Jeff met, which might be not the best example of how to recruit a student. So me and Jeff met for the first time in 2010 when I was an undergrad at the University of Aberdeen, and I'd been roped into volunteering at the British Society for History of Science conference. And I met Jeff as I handed him a whiskey at a whiskey tasting event that unwisely was before dinner. And I handed him several more, and off we went to dinner. Terrible BSHS student accommodation dinners as they are. And Jeff came over and said, "Could you take us on a pub crawl around Aberdeen later?" And that little rumour spread like wildfire. And in the course of an hour-long dinner, 70 people were coming on said pub crawl. So off we marched down, open over the hill, into the centre of Aberdeen from the university. And at the front with Jeff trying to quicken the pace to separate from the 70 people, so it could become a quieter pub crawl. And we got into conversation about people, famous physicists, and I was able to point out to Jeff's delight Maxwell's flats on Union Street and whether Thomson's had lectured at Marcia College. And as I pointed everyone into a pub called Prince of Wales, Jeff had made it quite clear that he didn't really want real ale, which seemed odd because he came across quite strongly as a real ale man. And that did I not know where the whiskey bar was that the locals went to? So into the pub we went and out the back door, having abandoned everyone at the bar. And we crossed the road to the grill, where Jeff spotted instantaneously a locked case behind the bar, which contained Port Ellen. And he got very excited and promptly ordered 3 measures of Port Ellen with the University of Manchester credit card, and sat down and explained, what was I going to do later with my life? 3 whiskies later, I had an invite to Manchester. So, we're going to do exactly what we did last time. We're going to move on to 2 longer talks, and then we're going to have 2 reminiscences. We're going to try and stick to time. Panelists agree. Excellent, because it's lunch and people get upset. So we're going to start with Xavier Roqué from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. I'll just let you fire away.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Sam. I think this is the most difficult paper I've ever given. And I regret it a lot not being here for Jeff's funeral. And I'm immensely grateful to have the chance to talk to you today about the work we did together and my reminiscences of him. I should begin by telling you, I met Jeff on paper back in 1991. As a member of the British Society for the History of Science, I received a booklet or pamphlet with the list of theses, work in progress. And Jeff's thesis caught my attention. There was someone in Cambridge working on radioactivity. That was interesting. I was working on my own dissertation about, hard to tell now, quantum electrodynamics in the interwar years. And Jeff's dissertation had a connection with that. I met him again, indirectly again, a few months later at the manuscript reading room of Cambridge University Library. His signature told me he had been reading some of the dissertations in experimental physics done at the Cavendish in the 1930s, and he had been the one person to do so since they were posted. And this thesis interested us both at the time. The most amazing thing is that right after that, these are the theses listed in his PhD, Simon talked us about. The most amazing thing is that I haven't yet met him personally, but he wrote me. And you need to bear in mind We hadn't met yet. I was working in Barcelona. My English wasn't good, not that it's much better now. I had trained as a physicist. He was becoming a historian, working at an excellent department. But he took the first step. And I think that tells a lot. I was so, I must say, impressed at the time, not of course because he was writing from Cambridge, but because of the things he said, how he offered to help, how he explained in a nutshell what he was doing. And that short paragraph, which you might or might not be able to read, for me, told a lot. That was an inspiration. He said, my research concerns the Cavendish and the Ernst Rutherford, and looks at the ways in which different resources, instruments, theories, men, money were put to work to produce stable scientific results. I've done some work on the discovery of the neutron from a sociological perspective and have written a couple of papers on Francis Aston, on the mass spectrograph, which he offered to send me. And I'm especially interested, in the history of radioactivity and nuclear physics. So that's what he was doing. And I have to say, that was like quite inspiring, because as a trained physicist, I wasn't looking at the physics of the 30s in precisely that way. So I came to know through Jeff's work many other works of people in the room, and that changed. Yeah, that changed my life. I think I could never be a physicist again, and I became a historian. We may have met actually shortly afterwards at the postgraduate meeting again in Cambridge in January '92, but I was flu at the time, so I don't remember. But we met for sure in the University of California, Berkeley, in July '92, at the summer school in the history of science. And there, it is a pity he couldn't make it today. Dominic was one of the lecturers, so we met Dominic, who told us about Magnum PI as his role model for what historians do. That stuck in my mind forcefully. So Jeff was there, as there were other radioactivists, as we began calling ourselves. You have just read. Alexei was there, Alexei Kuchashnikov, Ivana Gambado, Matthias Dovi. So a number of people we've come across over time. For the first time, I think I realized I belonged to a group of people who were dealing with a common set of problems and who could share methods, ideas, practices. And Jeff was most generous, especially with that bizarre source which might help you in your work, and which he had this ability to unpack, to get, and I'm sure many of you may have had that same experience. We completed our dissertations at about the same time, July '93. Jeff's dissertation I read through, and many of the things that were there and he subsequently published influenced my own work, as I'll tell you, because we were asked to discuss something we had done together, or we had been both involved. And many of those things had to do with this dissertation. Of course, it dealt with the memory of the nuclear age, bomb historiography, Jeff liked to call it, and he discussed how those chemists and physicists in the 30s, in the interwar years, had gathered, cooperated, discussed things. We had a lot of the Cavendish and Cambridge before, but the nice thing about the dissertation is how it blended together the different sites in the network. Of course, there was the Cavendish, there was also the Statistical in Paris, and the Kaiserliche Institute in Berlin, and there was Brussels and Copenhagen, and so on and so forth. And this network and the political economy of radio, this I learned from him, and that was a huge influence on the work. After that summer of '93, Jeff moved to Manchester and I moved to Cambridge. And so we could have been together there, we were close, we wrote each other often, and we kept in touch basically because those people I've mentioned and some more other people gathered at the same places the first radioactivists had met in the 30s. And thinking about this celebration today, I was astonished to realize how often we have met at precisely the same places, of course, HPS by the old Cavendish, but then also at the Arstatikerie, close to the original lab, and then in Berlin. Most amazingly, in May '95, at the Hotel Métropole in Brussels, where a celebration of the Solvay conferences was held, and the organizers decided we had to be in the same hotel, the Métropole, where the Solvay speakers have been in 1911, talking about what was nucleus and so on and so forth. So that was an amazing experience. That was really feeling like a radioactivists. So we reinstated, we recreated those things and conditions of possibility that made radioactivity and the transition to nuclear physics possible in the first place. These meetings were many during those years, from '95 up until the end of that decade. And I want to focus on one of them in particular, which took place at La Villette in June '96. It was organized together with Soraya Boudia, a leading radioactivist, I would say, our Madame Curie, because she directed the Curie Museum in Paris for a short while. The Soraya, with me and Benedict Vincent, who also took part in that conference in June, which led to this publication, and a special issue on the Curie and Joliot-Curie labs. Dominique had much to do with that issue. He wrote the introduction, as did John Krieg, whom you all know. And for me, that's the content, and Jeff's paper at the end, the French connection. To me, that conference summarizes much of the work of the radioactivist, and that shows strongly Jeff's influence on what counts. I think this set of papers is very self-conscious. That's something he insisted a lot. He made us very conscious of memory. He made us very conscious of how physicists and chemists rebuilt the discipline, and we took that insight there. He insisted on the way to provide an account of our own, which did not just rely on those existing accounts, but built on these new insights based on shared practices, material culture, painful attention to instrument making and instrument functioning. That we took from him. He rejected teleology, presence sensitism. He was skeptical. He was sensitive to disciplinary boundaries. And this issue is all about that. And he decided to focus on the French connection because, of course, he was much interested in knowing how that other leading lab in Paris in the 30s had reacted vis-a-vis the developments in Cambridge and the discovery or revealing of this new particle. So that's what he did in that paper. And I wrote a paper dealing with the radium industry and the Curie lab, which it will probably be evident to most of you after what we've heard. It's strongly dependent on that stay in Cambridge, our letters, our emails, things we exchanged. And so when in the archive I found those letters which had not been picked up by any historian before, I would realize they might be important just because we have been discussing how important industry and medicine have been for the development of radioactivity in that period. So I owe a lot to that, and this picture, which is by far my favorite, the Curie album, showing Curie in 1921 talking with the guys who had manufactured the radium he was bringing back to Europe after the women of America had donated it to her. That picture showed Curie under a completely different light, which somehow has trickled down the historiography. Talking about that work, I should mention that right at the beginning, even before that meeting in '96, Jeff had written a short piece on the Cavendish for a French magazine, the Cahiers des Sciences de Vie. I think Simon had a lot to do with that. He was a bit anxious that the journal had softened his account, but in the end he had battled with a friend and had managed to get it through. And I was invited to write for the Cahiers on Curie before I had published anything on her. And I think that's also very important. Not that I published there. The fact that Jeff was writing for Cahiers, which was a popular magazine, belonged to the group Sciences de Vie. He was writing about the Cavendish, he was writing about the radioactivists before having finished his PhD. And so popularization, outreach, we call it now, came first. And that was extremely important for us both. I learned that also from him. So in a way, we got down to research coming from a different perspective. I've kept that, I've enjoyed that a lot, so that's something I've retained. Yeah, I'd like to finish. I expected Dominic to be here today, and so I have a quote from him. It goes back to 2003. It is from a book, Science Argent Politique, which got translated into Catalan, amazingly. It's also translated into Spanish. And in it, Dominic reflects on what happened recently. And Simon mentioned that period between '89 and today as a global period. And back in 2003, Dominic was also thinking what's happened to us after the Cold War. And in the same way that the reactivists lived in the interwar years, I like to think that we, the new radioactivists, have lived in a sort of interwar period from the end of the Cold War, and I dare not name it a war, but we are facing really huge challenges today. And in the same way that the reactivists faced actual war in Europe and exile, we are today facing huge menaces in the form of populism and the new right. That's no joke. In my country, the far right, vindicating Franco's legacy, has just won 80 seats in the Parliament of Andalusia and is very well posed to get many more seats in the general election to be held in a couple of months. So this is worrying, and Dominic reflected a few years ago about that right at the end of a book on regimes of knowledge, on science and the economy and policy, and he said that there was this painful fact still facing again, the ordinary violence of powerful nations, of feeble ones. And that's actually the last paragraph of the book. We shall not renounce the idea we have forged over the last decades, the value of democracy and responsible participation. And I feel that's also a bit of gratitude that I wanted to share. I also think I learned some of that together with Jeff. And I would have loved to bring more pictures, but some of them are still in the form of slides. I haven't been able to retrieve them, but I did retrieve that one taken very close a few years ago with that. an anonymous passerby. We asked someone, I don't remember who, but I'm so glad we asked someone, and I didn't take his picture. Thank you. I forgot showing you the lovely postcards he sent on occasion.
Okay.
They don't get advantage. You can take them with you. Be all day. Thank you.
So you're just going to swap straight through. Going to massively run you now.
Sure.
All right. So we're going to move over to Mass Fridlund, University of Gothenburg.
Thank you. I usually tell my students that before a talk I'm always nervous, but usually it goes away when I start talking. I'm not sure what's going to happen today. Because this is of course talk I would not like to have done, but I'm really happy and proud to be invited to talk about Jeff and my work with Jeff, or my learning with Jeff, I would say. A little bit of background before I start talking about research we share, the ideas we share. I met Jeff for the first time in 1994. Already heard about the summer school, International Summer School, and me and Jeff went in 94 to the International Summer School in History of Science in Paris. Then I was just sort of basically a PhD student, just had finished my first year. Jeff was of course a PhD student, not anymore. He had finished, I think, more or less like a year ago or so. But for some reason, I remember sort of he scared me a little bit. He was making some joke about something. And anyway, but very soon we hit it off, so that got really close. And then it became even more so that when he later on, I think it was a year later, but Natalie might correct me there. Yeah, exactly. Maybe a year later, so when Jeff actually came and stayed in at my university in Stockholm at KTH for a couple of months. Teaching there, or it was swapping with another PhD student, Thomas Kaisenfeld, that was then doing his teaching in Manchester. Jeff came over and was sitting there and joining us for a year. And then we really sort of got close over many years, and in some ways also developed a friendship, and also shared secrets. For many, many years I walked around sort of not telling anyone that I knew that Jeff Hughes, the famous Jeff Hughes, actually started his career as a train spotter. Yes, I was sworn to secrecy about that. And then I also met Natalie when she came over and visited Jeff, and we had some really nice time together there. And since then, so we kept on meeting, usually at international conferences like in Short in London. But then also it sort of came over, until I came over in 2000 and stayed here. Actually, I had a mini postdoc for a couple of months here at Manchester. It's something I got partly thanks to Jeff and my friendship and collegial relationship with Jeff. But so, and I must say, I'm really proud not just to call Jeff Hughes a close colleague, but also call him a close friend. It was an honor, not an honor, but a privilege. It's a privilege, and a joy to have had this time with Jeff, and of course, I wish there had been much longer. And yes, so here you see one of these pictures actually. What I only it's correct, so that Jeff was, didn't really like being photographed, and it's actually the only picture I have of Jeff. Me, Jeff, and John, which is here somewhere, sitting at the Crowbar, I believe, is in Manchester here, together with some grad students and other visitors. Yeah, it's a very good memory, a very good picture. I like it.
That's Maria. Maria Thomas.
Yes. Okay, so now let's talk.
yeah, this is going to be a little bit different, I think. I hope so. It's going to be a little bit different talk. And first of all, I've been mocked about sort of the title here already. It's my long subtitle here, but some of you might sort of recognize that because it's in some ways alluding to something Jeff has written about, and that's about sort of the nuclear condition. But I'm not talking about the nuclear condition. I'm also going to talk about towards the understanding of the responses to the terrorism condition, which is my field of research, is the technology of terrorism. Or I also have an alternative title. What is Anglo-American nuclear culture? Understanding nuclear energy. And those of you sort of historian of physics or historian of nuclear physics should, I hope, sort of see my allusions here to one of what I think is one of Jeff's best articles. What is British nuclear culture? Understanding uranium-235. And what I'm going to do here, actually, I'm going to talk some about sort of my research and how I was inspired and sort of what Jeff and so some of what sort of we talked about, Jeff and I. We're also going to do something new. I've actually written a new paper here today. In a way, I'm trying to channel Jeff to some degree, at least being inspired by Jeff and being inspired by his work on nuclear culture. And I want to sort of take his article and take the ideas he brings forth in this article and try it out on my research, on my research on nuclear culture. But first, I'm going to also talk a little bit about two articles, because this title here, The Affordances of Jeff, is a reference to an article I wrote about affording terrorism, where Jeff was in many ways, he was one of the key reasons that that article actually became written. Because for a long time, I think until, I would say from 2007 or thereabouts, 2006, I went around and I sort of picked up this about affordances, which I thought was a very good concept. I so often talked about it. And Jeff all the time sort of bugged me. So what is this thing, affordances? Come on, tell me. And then we sort of shared this long discussion about what it was and what wasn't. So in a way, really honed sort of my thinking there. We sort of shared articles about it. So then in 2011, this article was published. So that's sort of one article I'm going to talk about. And then I am also going to talk about another article you see, Bullets, Buckets and Bombs, also another article where I talk somewhat about nuclear mindedness. And that was also something we had a long discussion for a long time. As many of you know, Jeff shared sort of an interest in all things nuclear, and especially nuclear culture. And that was also something that we shared. My background is I'm an engineer physicist, and one of my first papers was in history of physics, but then I left history of physics to a large degree behind, moved on towards history of technology. But in this first paper, I wrote about the Manhattan Project and the nuclear bomb. And of course, as all of you know, that's something that Jeff has written a lot about since then. But so what I want to do in this second part of this talk, I'm going to talk about this piece of art, nuclear energy, Henry Moore's sculpture, and you're going to know much more than you want to know about that. So, that's out at the University of Chicago. But first, the title here, and this slide is I took this slide from my last presentation where Jeff attended in 2013 when I was invited to give a talk about the fort. This was after this article had finished that Jeff has sort of helped me in a way to birth forward. And then we talked about these affordances. And I said the title is The Affordances of Jeff. And what I mean by that is in many ways, and that's to explain what I mean by that, I also have to explain a little bit about what this affordances is about. This is a concept basically about how the things, or the things that surrounds us, how objects that surrounds us, or important entities, material entities surround us, how it shapes our lives, or how it makes new things possible, how it makes new actions possible. And this is, as I said from this presentation, affordance is a relational socio-technical concept. Connects technological effects in societal choice and change. And this is the definition here from William Gibson, the person that formulated this concept once upon a time, from 1971. Well, explain what affordances is. The meaning or value of a thing consists of what it affords. What a thing affords a particular observer, species or observer, points to the organism, the subject. The shape and size, the composition and rigidity of the thing, however, points to its physical existence, the object. But these determine what the affords the observer. The affordances point both ways. What the thing is and what it means are not separate. So this is basically about when person, the user, meets an object, what the sort of the new thing that emerged out of this meeting. And I'm saying this, that's why I have this title, The Affordances of Jeff, because when Jeff and I met and we talked about things, new things emerged from that. That sort of was in a way sort of new thoughts and ideas coming from both of us, and sort of that was afforded by our discussions. They were afforded by sort of joint thinking in that sense. So the affordances of Jeff, in a way, is not what the affordances. It's not Jeff that had those affordances. The affordances was something that we shared, that came out of this jointly. So these articles, of course, are my articles, but they're very much also Jeff's articles and methods through our affordances there, how we sort of things we shared, the discussions we shared, the ideas we wrestled with jointly. So that was so, as I said, that Jeff was very influential in that sort of making that my affordance chapter coming out and actually coming into real life, not just out of my head and also into the paper. And the other article, as mentioned, is about bullet buckets and bombs, and that's about something I call terror-mindedness. But I'm interested in terrorism. I'm interested in how, in many ways, how we, in our daily lives, sort of have integrated terrorism, whether we like it or not. The example I usually use is when you go on a bus and maybe you see a backpack standing there on the bus, no one around. What is the first or second, maybe third thought you think about? You may think, well, this might be a bomb. Of course, it's never a bomb. But still, my point is, but we still think that thought, most of us, at some point. That means sort of that we have integrated this idea that terrorism is a part of our daily lives, whether we like it or not. So what I'm sort of, as an historian, I'm interested in this, sort of how the things we have, how we, as communities, how we develop new things to cope with these fears, cope with these terrors, these terrorisms. And historically speaking, and I sort of divide this into three parts. Air-mindedness, which is the interwar period, and the Second World War, when the big threat, especially if you were living in cities, was about the next war, was seen to be about bombs from above, especially gas bombs from above. And then that sort of that fear, that man-made fear, is then sort of replaced to a large degree with the Cold War, by nuclear-mindedness. But then it's no more, it's still a threat of bombs from above, but now it's of course not bombs, but the bomb, the nuclear weapon. And then later on, so also the nuclear threat is to a large degree replaced, even though the nuclear weapons are still there, still today, replaced by terror bombs or bombs from below, not from above, but from the street. And in my research, I don't go into if this is a realistic threat or not. That's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how we cope with this, how we sort of learn to live with this by using things, by developing things, by inventing things, and also by, in a way, how we incorporate sort of these fears into the things we make. So that's when we come to my sort of new take on this, inspired by Jeff. And this article, What is British Nuclear Culture, Understanding Uranium-235. I'm now going to sort of show you the start of a new article. What is Anglo-American nuclear culture, Understanding Nuclear Energy? The person you see here is Henry Moore, famous British sculptor. And this, what you see here, is him standing or posing in the underground of London. Moore, during the Second World War, I think most people know him as a sculptor. But during the war, he didn't really sculpt, but he painted and he drew. And after the war, he became famous for his so-called shelter drawings of people in the London underground, the subway system. And that was seen as sort of capturing the sort of the fear and the anxiety and the coping of the time. And he was hailed as sort of one of these new humanists, so the true humanist in the sense of capturing this sort of anxiety and the fear of the Blitz on London. And here you see some of his most famous pictures from these shelter drawings. So in that sense, Moore was considered meant to be a really good sort of, call it medium or capturing of this fear of air-mindedness, as I described before, bombs from above. But then, as we know, of course, the Second World War ended, but and the fear of the war was replaced by new fears, by nuclear fears. And then also Moore, in many ways, also followed along and continued sort of trying to channel these new fears. And this is an interesting piece. This is a sculpture, or a sculpture group, inaugurated in 1948 in Battersea Park in London. And this is interesting. This was supposed to have been sent to MoMA. This was supposed to have been sold to MoMA in New York. But then Moore changed his mind and actually then was sort of put up for a competition, and then also had, I think, donated, I think, to this best part of the city of London, if I'm not mistaken. But the point about this is something that was developed during the war, and these people are looking towards the skies, looking towards the heavens, not all, the skies at least, they're not heavens. And this was seen as sort of in some ways sort of capturing the Second World War, where people were looking towards the skies to see if the planes were coming. But in a way, this also fitted with this new period. Also then, in this new period, in the Cold War, also people looking towards the skies, looking for planes coming, but of course, not the same kind of planes. Not planes carrying bombs, but the bomb at this time. So what I want to do now is sort of, once again, following, inspired by Jeff, not look so much at Moore, in a sense, not to look so much at what Moore has been, but look at the responses, or rather, in some ways you can say, the reasons behind, or in a way, the channeling of these new kind of ideas about the nuclear through this. So looking at how people received these new fears, and how the arts of Moore, the nuclear Moors, became a medium for these thoughts. What you see here is one of Moore's sculptures called Helmet Head #1. This is also something that came sort of carried over, this motif of the helmet or the protected human, was something that was carried over from the Second World War, but was then got a new meaning, and this was seen by many as capturing this new Cold War fear in the 1950s. And this got even more sort of accentuated in 1952 at the Venice Biennale, when a group of British sculpture was sort of exhibited at the Biennale. And also at Moore, which was the celebrated British sculpture, the foremost living sculpture, not just in Britain, but by many considered in the world, was then sort of in a way, inviting you to this Biennale with the sculpture outside it. But inside, it was more about these new sculptures. And at this Biennale, there was coined a famous, at least within art history, a famous term called the geometry of fear. Because these new, young British sculptors were seen as capturing this new time. And here's a quote from Herbert Reed, art critic, that sort of coined this concept. He said, "These new images belong to the iconography of despair or of defiance. Here are images of flight, of ragged claws scuttling across the floor of silent seas, of excoriated flesh, frustrated sex, the geometry of fear. Their art is close to the nerves, nervous wiring." And Moore was seen as sort of inspiring this new group. So they were all seen as this group of sculptors who were capturing this new sense of fear, this new sense of nuclear fear. And that also led, once again, I'm interested in response, that also led other people to interpret Moore's work as capturing this nuclear anxiety. Here we have Erich Neumann, German-American psychoanalyst and art critic, or art psychologist, you could say, which in 1959 wrote a book about Moore when he talked about the helmet head here, what he saw capturing this new fear. The contemporary unnaturalness of purely technological death, the inhuman ruthlessness of technological science, of the warfare that is its identical twin, stares out of this helmet with everlasting metallic indifference. And indeed, war and disaster as manifestations of technological death are much closely connected with the anxiety of modern man, that is the danger of natural death. It's almost a wishful fantasy if he wants to be allowed to die peacefully in bed, instead of being cut to pieces by shell splinters, buried under collapsing houses, roasted alive by atom bombs, and reduced to mass of suppuration by radioactive fallout. So we see here an example of this new nuclear culture, how this art is then being received and maybe in some ways reconceived to configure this new nuclear condition, as Jeff would have said. Time goes on. And during the Cultural War, there was also, as we all know, the Cold War was filled with politics, and also, of course, with cultural politics. And Moore was then seen as being one of these sort of he was then described as the foremost living sculptor. And it was very important, especially in British cultural politics, and especially Anglo-American British cultural politics. Here's a quote from a journal, art journal of the time, 1961, that talked about Moore, that said that his own individual spark was in tune with the zeitgeist. In a restless age of wars, when population ideas were on the move, Moore's massive dynamic calm was immediately appealing and inspirational. It is difficult for us in Britain to understand just how much Moore is revered abroad. It is considered quite simply as the greatest living sculpture. And this is something that has been picked up by scholars of the nuclear, like Jeff, and talking about sort of how then Moore became a tool in this sort of cultural politics. Pauline Rose, art historian, said, sculpture could loosely be characterized as symbolizing Western democracy and civilized values. Britain's culture proved valuable to the United States in defining what might constitute transatlantic civilized values. Okay, and now, soon, we are reaching nuclear energy. So this is the background of what came to be the nuclear energy. What you see here is William H. McNeill. The historians of technology in the audience should recognize his name. He wrote the famous book, The Pursuit of Power, focusing on the role of technology in the military and in war. And he, in 1960s, 1963 to be precise, was a professor at the University of Chicago, professor of history. And he has described that how he, almost every day, walked by the famous site of the first self-sustained nuclear chain reaction that Enrico Fermi produced and his team produced in 1942. And he said that and that stand, it was not to really commemorate, it was not something to sort of to be proud of. He said, the stand, the previous stand that produced this chain reaction, was subsequently torn down, and the site became an eyesore, featuring broken pavement with weeds coming up through the cracks behind the chain wire fence. On the wire hung a bronze notice, the one you can see here on the picture. Here. Originally designed to decorate the doorway to the football stand, telling passers-by that this was where the radioactive pile had once stood. One day when walking past the site, I was overwhelmed by the contrast between the weeds and rust before my eyes and the monumental celebration of imperial glory that I witnessed on Vienna's Ringstrasse when visiting that city for the first time the previous summer. I decided that university could do better and began to say so. So what you see here is sort of that McNeill feels that this momentous achievement of University of Chicago, where he was a professor, needed a more sort of fitting monument to this. And so he became head of a committee that was going to put up a monument for this, instead of this plaque on the wire fence. So he contacted Henry Moore and basically asked if he would be prepared to make a monument to this foremost living sculpture. And here's some exchanges between McNeill and Moore. He wrote a letter and said, when he's trying to convince Moore that he should take on this task, properly carried through, the monument can become a place of pilgrimage for all the world, holy ground in the true modern sense, a monument to man's triumphs, charged with high hope and profound fear, just as every triumphant breakthrough has always been. And then later on in another letter, when he actually gave him the official assignment from the university to make this the statue. A statue might body forth the awfulness of the event. I mean awful in its proper sense, of inspiring awe, a sense of greatness, power and danger, all at once. And Moore took it on. He designed what he called atom peace, but which the university didn't really like because it was too much alluding to peace, I mean war and peace in a sense. So they instead asked me, could you possibly rename it into something like nuclear energy? Once again, to get away from this sort of the military aspect there. What we see here is McNeill, together with an architect, situating this nuclear energy with Moore's instructions. Moore is sort of pointing out how they should situate it there on the stand. In 1964, this was inaugurated, and this is what you can see today when you go to the University of Chicago, where the place of the previous sort of the Fermi's radioactive pile. We have this now, this monument to atom nuclear energy, or if you would trust anymore, to atom peace. And also, once again, this is one of several receptions. As I just have started, this is something I want to continue with, always with Jeff's sort of words about how to try to give this reception a true focus on the reception of the cultural and social aspect that goes into this, but more looking at the reception of it, because in a way, the Moore story, the Moore side of the story is not really that interesting, because we also see that he actually makes up stuff afterwards, what inspired him in this. So it's more interesting to see actually what work did these things do. But this is one of the first works it did, because while this statue was inaugurated in 1967, William McNeill was working on his first edition of World History, one of his first books on world history. And he then sort of, in this book, included actually a picture and a caption about this new monument. And it was actually so early that it couldn't actually include the picture of the statue, but it had to include a picture of a model of the statue. But what it said there was, this brooding present, the monument in Chicago, gives visual form to the hopes and fears with which we contemplate our fate. Sentiments based today on new premises, yet presumably of no greater poignancy than in times past. Since then as now, life and death hung daily in the balance. And there I'm going to end my reminiscence. And in a way, I hope I conveyed some of sort of how Jeff inspired me. But I also want in a way to, through this, also show that Jeff and his work lives on and keeps on inspiring us, at least inspiring me. And I hope it also can be of some inspiration for you after this day. Thank you.
Okay, to finish and round up this session, we're going to have two short reminiscences. Marcia Holmes and Robert Hood, do you want to join me up here? And then we'll start with Marcia and then. Yeah.
Well, I stand here in gratitude to Jeff and to CHSTM. Jeff mentored me and hosted me for a year while I was a visiting student here at CHSTM in the final year of my PhD. I was a student at the University of Chicago, and I was introduced to Jeff through my mentors there, Allison Winter and Adrian Johns, who of course have been at Cambridge with Jeff. And thanks to Jeff and CHSTM, I had a community here who helped me sort of rise out of that dark cave that can be finishing up your PhD thesis. And I found Jeff to be everything that Allison and Adrian had promised. He was lively, he was welcoming and engaging, and he introduced me to CHSTM and to his reading group, most importantly, where I found a community of people who were similarly like Jeff, maybe purposely so, because Jeff was really the leader of that reading group. I even then tried to fade into the background. But I guess from my students' perspective, we all sat there, the students did, waiting for Jeff to speak. He might be tucked in a corner, he might have thought us all fine and felt like his job was done. We're like, what brilliant things he went to say. And similarly in CHSTM seminars, what was Jeff going to ask? Usually something along the lines of, oh, thank you for your talk, it was very interesting, blah, 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 I understood every nuance of it, and I can sum it up in 2 sentences, blah, blah, blah. Well, what do you think of Ulrich Beck's Risk Society? We had that ability to ask bigger questions, interesting questions. We also, I found, have the ability to ask smaller, practical questions that really mattered. So, in mentoring me, one of the most useful things he did was introduce me to Roland, who was working on a topic very similar to my own. I'm going to get to the smaller question in a minute, but Roland was writing his thesis on British ergonomics, and I was writing about sort of American quasi-equivalent, what's awkwardly possibly called human engineering psychology. And in trying to tell Jeff about my research, which was kind of a muddle in my own mind, he kept coming back to the same question, which is, well, how many of these psychologists were there? And I just looked at him every time, what are you asking? What does it matter to you if I say 50 or 100? Actually, in reflection, it's a very important question because it meant that my psychologists weren't the kind of investigative community that maybe Jeff was used to dealing with, or Roland was dealing with, and which is a significant thing to say about them, in fact. But I don't think I ever got a chance to tell Jeff that actually his question had finally reached its target. And maybe all of you mentors in the room might feel better knowing that sometimes the questions you ask us, even though it doesn't seem to really reflect in what we're doing or saying, like they stay with us and possibly haunt us past your own life. I guess in thinking about what I was going to say to you, I got in touch with Adrian Johns just to talk about Jeff. And Adrian told me, not to be tweeted, that Jeff, even as a PhD student, was the kind of person who didn't come to his positions lightly, didn't take on positions because they were the fashionable thing to say or to think, though certainly he was, I don't know, not fashionable, but influential in his own way. He came to his positions through his own hard work, his own thought. He argued them to himself and then presented them to others. And you could tell that he expected the same from his students. And he inspired the same in his colleagues. And I, in hindsight, found those kind of people here at CHSTM. And I'm grateful to Jeff for that.
I come here not as a student of Jeff, nor originally as somebody who was inspired by his writings, but as somebody who was inspired by the person. He was somebody I met at conferences, and we found a spark, and we collaborated on 3 rather separate but related projects, all combined, all integrated by an interest which Simon expressed of bringing the public into the laboratory. Rather than the public looking through a window into the laboratory, for Jeff, the public were always there and co-constructing the physics. Before describing in more detail, I thought I would read to you a self-description of his own interest by Jeff that he wrote for a grant proposal we did together in 2008. So this is Jeff's words describing what he's interested in. Eschewing the progressive narratives that have dominated the historiography of physics, his work situates modern physics in the wider context of more traditional forms of physics as practiced in universities, industries, and government research establishments. As well as exploring the contingencies of scientific practice in this period, he has investigated the cultural production of modern physics through the media, e.g. in his work on the science journalist J.G. Crowther and the popularizing activity of the Braggs, and in fiction and film. Hughes has also worked on the development of wireless in the interwar period and on post-war radar technology. In addition to his ongoing work in the history of the physical sciences, he has strong overarching interests in the communication and public understanding of both science and the history of science and technology. He has worked as a consultant with Manchester's Museum of Science and Industry in the development of their new gallery on Manchester science. So Jeff is writing that in the autumn of 2008. At that time, we had just been, it was not brand new, but a new opportunity for the Science Museum to apply for grants, collaborative doctoral awards. And I was interested to see how the Science Museum could construct a science gallery which would not be a folk history of science to which the public were invited, but rather a folk history of the people who were themselves the audiences, who were themselves part of the story which we were going to tell. And Jeff understood this immediately. This would not be based on old science, on old history of science, because most history of science is not written like that, but on new research. And we therefore could use one of these new collaborative doctoral awards to generate that research, which we wrote a proposal for a grant for research on modern physics, and how that was co-constructed with new ideas of the public as well as of physics in the interwar years. That led to a success. We got the money and led to the work of Imogen Clark, who got her PhD some years later. Jeff and I was then approached by Peter Hennessy, the historian at Queen Mary, of course, Lord Hennessy now, who persuaded me that really, following on my earlier work on penicillin and also work on Cold War science, that I should really be interested in nuclear power history. This was not an area I'd traditionally been involved in, but I had been a student here of Roger Williams, who would go on to write a book on the standard book on the development of nuclear power, and the story in turn of how Roger Williams came to be giving those lectures and writing that book is a story he should tell you rather than me independently sort of retailing it like Chinese whispers, but has close connections with the fact that Brian Flowers, who had come from Harwell, was professor of physics here in the 1960s. I was interested in how the public could be seen to have co-constructed nuclear power too, and talked to Jeff, by now a close conspirator. And if you want to know the word conspirators, you have to look to H.G. Wells, as Simon reminded us. Jeff understood this perfectly, and we worked together for some time on a grant proposal on the how nuclear power was constructed not just by policymakers in Whitehall, but regionally, and what it meant, for instance, to have a nuclear power station in Transfinite, and how that affected, how the local dynamics affected the design of that power station, and its operation. Unfortunately, at that moment, I think Jeff's health began to deteriorate, and we were not able to bring that application, on which we worked for about a year, to a successful conclusion. However, Jeff did continue to act as a scholar, and when I did get a grant for a project for a big conference, which would include a conference to commemorate 50 years of poison gas being used on the, wasn't 50 years, it was the centenary of the use of poison gas on the Western Front in 1915, Jeff immediately was interested. And Frank, who's also here, was a part of the organizing committee, and we organized the conference Being Modern in April 2015, held on the very exactly 100 years after that Battle of Ypres. And I'm very pleased that Jeff could contribute a paper which again showed how ordinary people, radio hams, not ivory tower inhabitants, were the workers at the Cavendish laboratory. And he had unusual pictures in the published paper of members of the Cambridge University Radio Society, also as Cambridge students, who would make modern physics. It was always a pleasure to work with Jeff. He was somebody who I think does live on in the work of many of us here. And it is, I think, a continuing sadness that he has to make his contribution indirectly, but nonetheless gigantically. Thank you.
So I'm going to rip because I have no idea what's happening yet. Are we doing lunch here?
Lunch in 257.
Okay, so
There is signage.
there is signage apparently. Follow the Chistomers. It's in the Chistom seminar room, Chistomers. Lunch is downstairs, and we will reconvene one floor down. We will one floor down, yeah, not all the way down, one floor down. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock. That's the 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Sorry, 2 o'clock.
Ingen livsstil.